I woke up as usual, at 5:30 in the morning without an alarm clock. My body remembered the schedule, even 12 years after retirement. My joints echoed with a familiar ache as I rolled onto my side and slowly sat up on the bed. The large double bed I now occupied only a narrow strip on my right side as Evelyn still slept beside me. The habits of a 77-year-old man don't change, not even when there's no one to say so. Dom was silent as he'd been silent for the last 8 years since she'd left. Lung cancer. She never smoked, and I quit back in the 80s, but it didn't help. The doctor said something about genetics and bad luck. I told them they were incompetent. Putting on a warm robe, I headed for the kitchen. The ancient refrigerator hummed like a tractor, but I refused to change it. Evelyn had picked it out when we moved into this house in '79. We'd only just been able to afford our own place then, an old Victorian house on Havenworth Street in New Bedford, with chipped paint and creaky floorboards. But it was our home. I fixed every board with my own hands, repainted the facade 3 times, and the last time was 5 years ago, at 72. The neighbors were surprised. I just didn't want the house to look abandoned. "Good morning, Evelyn," I said into the void, reaching for the orange juice. My voice sounded hoarse and unpleasant. I coughed. The daily ritual hadn't changed. A glass of juice, oatmeal with raisins, peanut butter toast, and coffee black. No sugar. The old-fashioned percolator sizzled on the stove. Evelyn always said I was too stubborn to accept new things. She wanted a drip coffee maker. I never bought one. I regretted it now, as I regretted so many other things. I ate while looking out the window at the backyard. The old apple tree we'd planted when Lydia was 3 had long since stopped bearing fruit, but I wouldn't let it be cut down. Unlike my relationship with my daughter, at least the tree was still standing. The pension of a former municipal building inspector was not generous, but I had learned to live frugally. 32 years of inspecting foundations, load-bearing structures, and electrical wiring had taught me to see the weaknesses in everything: buildings, people, family relationships. Except the last one was the hardest to fix. After breakfast, I opened my day planner, a paper one, of course. I had mastered telephones and computers as much as I needed to. Today was Sunday, November 14th. A visit to Dr. Pearson for a blood pressure check was scheduled. Then chess with Wilford in the park, weather permitting. And then nothing until tonight. I picked up the phone. The old cot that Lydia had tried to replace with something smart last Christmas. I'd given up on it. Why do I need all these apps? I opened my contacts, 12 numbers in all. My finger hovered over my daughter's name. Lydia. I hadn't called her in 2 weeks, not since she hung up on me after my comment about her son Ethan spending too much time playing video games. "You have no right to tell me how to raise my children," she said then. "Especially since you haven't been a model father yourself. It wasn't fair. I provided for her, paid for college, never drank, never raised a hand. But Lydia, like her mother, always wanted something else: emotional support, acknowledgement of mistakes, apologies, things I considered a sign of weakness. I slammed the phone shut without calling. Instead, I showered, shaved thoroughly, as I'd done every morning for the past 60 years, and put on my usual clothes-ironed pants, collar shirt, and cardigan, even though I wasn't going anywhere until lunch. Evelyn always said I had the posture of a military man, even though I'd never served. "That's because you always need to look unwavering," she laughed. I missed her laugh the most. At 10 o'clock I began my rounds of the house, checking for new cracks in the walls, leaks under the sinks, weakened floorboards. The old house demanded constant attention like a cranky child. Not like my new neighbors to the right, a young couple with 2 children who bought the house 3 years ago and seemed to think the houses were self-maintained. I pointed out to them several times the sagging gutter and the rickety railing on the porch. They smiled, thanked me, and did nothing. Eventually I stopped talking. Let them learn from their mistakes. In the bedroom, I stopped at the dresser where the picture stood. Evelyn at our wedding, young, bright-eyed, and with a smile that seemed to say she knew a secret not available to the rest of us. Lydia in her prom dress. Lydia and her husband Nolan at their wedding. I stood next to her with a strained smile. And the last one, with her grandchildren, Ethan and Claire, taken 3 years ago. There have been no new photos since. Nolan Varley. I sighed, looking at my son-in-law. Things hadn't been good between us from the start. He'd come to ask for Lydia's hand in marriage, all pompous with his finance degree and his plans to start his own consulting firm. I asked about a specific business plan, about startup capital, about how he was going to compete with the big companies. He got nervous, started talking in generalities. I called him a dreamer. Lydia didn't speak to me for a week after that, and yet they got married. Nolan did start his own firm. Varley Financial Solutions was loud for an office the size of a closet, but he was luckier than I thought. The business grew. They bought a house in the suburbs, had kids, and I kept finding faults in his business strategy, in their parenting methods, in their choice of schools for their grandchildren. You just can't accept that anyone can be right but you, Evelyn told me a year before she died. I didn't respond. Arguing with my dying wife seemed wrong, but I didn't agree. After finishing my rounds of the house, I sat down in a chair with a shabby book on maritime history. New Bedford had once been the whaling capital of the world. Now it's just another declining New England industrial town clinging to its glorious past, and so am I. At noon, I set out to see Dr. Pearson, on foot despite my aching knee. His office was a 20-minute walk, and the walk was one of the few joys I had left. Past the old harbor where mostly tourist boats were now moored, past the whaling museum, past the courthouse where I'd once testified against a contractor who used substandard materials. I put him away for 5 years. Some people said I was too harsh. I thought I was fair. Your blood pressure is still elevated, Mr. Higgs, Dr. Pearson said, taking the cuff off my arm. Are you taking the medication I prescribed? Of course, I lied. I hated the pills. They made me feel weak. And how is your family? He asked, making notes on the chart. Dr. Pearson had treated all of us, me, Evelyn, and once Lydia, until she moved to her suburb with the private clinics. Fine, I replied. Another lie. After the appointment, I didn't go to the park. The weather had turned bad, a fine drizzle that made my knee protest more than usual. Instead, I went to Donna's, the only place that still served decent coffee at a reasonable price. Donna, a full-figured woman in her 60s, nodded as I sat down at my usual table by the window. "The usual, Abraham?" she asked, already pouring black coffee into a white ceramic mug. "The usual," I confirmed. "Have you heard from Lydia?" Donna was one of the few people who still asked about my family. "Nothing new." I sipped my coffee. Hot and strong, just the way I like it. "You know, sometimes you have to make the first move," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Pride is good up to a point." "I called her last month," I answered irritably. "She said she was busy." Donna only sighed and stepped back to the other customers. I knew she was right, but admitting it meant admitting I'd been wrong all these years. And I hated being wrong. Back at home, I checked the mail. Bills, ads, credit card offers, and an envelope with Claire's school logo on it. I opened it, even though it was addressed to the Varley family. Inside was an invitation to a school play. Claire was starring in some play. The date was in 2 weeks. I sat down, holding the invitation in my hands. Obviously, Lydia wasn't going to invite me. The envelope had gotten to me by mistake. The school must have used an old address. The phone rang. I flinched, almost startled, as if I'd been caught reading someone else's mail. "Abraham Higgs," I answered, formal as always. "Dad, it's me." Lydia's voice sounded strained. "Did you get the invitation to Claire's play?" I looked at the envelope in my hand. Yes, it just came. I asked the school not to send it to you, she sighed. Claire wanted to invite you herself, but after our last conversation, I'd like to come, I said, surprised at my sudden desire to see my granddaughter on stage. A long pause followed. Okay, Lydia said at last. But Dad, please, no comments about her acting, costumes, or how the school wastes money on productions instead of real education. Just show up and smile. I felt my lips pressed together into a thin line. I know how to behave in public, Lydia. Of course you do, her tone said otherwise. One more thing. We're having a family dinner this Saturday. Mom always insisted that the whole family get together at least once a month. I know we've missed a few. 9, I clarified. The last time we had dinner together was in February. Yeah, she coughed. Anyway, if you want, you can come over. 6 o'clock tonight. The invitation sounded as warm as an IRS audit notice. I'll be there, I said. Thank you for the invitation. Okay, she was quiet again. And Dad, please don't bring gifts for the kids without our consent. Last time, that game console. It was Ethan's birthday, I interrupted. The boy turned 13. All his friends play those games. Nolan and I decided to wait until he turned 15. You know that. We talked about it. It was a stupid rule, I said before I could stop myself. See? Her voice rose. That's why it's so hard to invite you. You're always undermining our authority and criticizing our decisions. I'm just giving my opinion, I replied. Your opinion isn't always required, Dad. Her voice sounded tired. Just come over on Saturday, no presents, and please be polite. She hung up before I could answer. I stared at the phone in my hand. Lydia had always been sensitive, even as a child. Too much like her mother saw the best in people, even when the evidence said otherwise. But unlike Evelyn, she hadn't learned to accept me for who I was. To her, my directness was always rudeness. My integrity was stubbornness. My caring was controlling. I put the phone down and looked at the invitation. Claire was 11, and she was more practical than her mother at that age. Maybe because she looked more like me, the same square jaw, the same straight brown hair, the same gaze that seemed to see right through people. Ethan, on the other hand, was a complete carbon copy of his father, soft, compliant, constantly with his head in the clouds. I carefully placed the invitation on the table, a family dinner. After 9 months of Cold War, maybe this was a chance to set things right, or at least establish a truce for the sake of the grandkids. I walked over to the hall closet and pulled out an old box. Inside was a watch, a gold pocket watch that had been passed down in our family from father to son for 4 generations. My father had given it to me when I turned 21. I had planned to give it to my son, but Evelyn and I only had Lydia. Now, the watch was going to go to Ethan. I opened the lid. The clock was still running, though it was running 2 minutes behind a day. Like myself, still functioning, but not as accurately as it used to. Saturday, family dinner. Perhaps it was time for a reconciliation, or at least an attempt. I closed the clock and returned it to the box. Despite our differences, Lydia was my only daughter, and Ethan and Claire were my only grandchildren. I couldn't afford to lose them like I'd lost Evelyn. With that thought, I returned to my chair and continued reading my book, listening to the old house creak around me like the old man I had become. Friday came with wet snow turning the streets of New Bedford into a gray mess. I stared out the window, pondering the upcoming dinner at Lydia's tomorrow. Anxiety settled somewhere between my sternum and stomach, like an uncooked piece of meat. Since we talked on Monday, I'd been tempted to call her twice and decline, find some excuse pressure, weather, whatever, but pride wouldn't let me. Abraham Higgs doesn't run from family obligations, even if his presence is perceived as a forced favor. I dressed warmer than usual, a wool sweater under my cardigan, a scarf Evelyn had knitted for me 20 years ago. Its pile had long since frayed, but I couldn't bring myself to buy a new one. The last bits of her presence in this house were worth more to me than gold. At 10 o'clock, I went outside. My knee immediately ached from the cold, but I ignored it. I had an appointment with Timothy Reeves, my former colleague from the inspectorate. I'd been trying to get in touch with him for 3 weeks now. Yesterday, he finally called and suggested we meet at the Seaside Cafe, an unassuming waterfront establishment that served decent fish and didn't ask too many questions. Abraham Higgs. Timothy rose to shake my hand as I entered the cafe. His graying hair had thinned even more since we'd last met 6 months ago, and his reddish nose suggested that his friendship with whiskey had not waned. Had the great and terrible Higgs himself condescended to meet the humble pensioner? I frowned. Timothy had always been fond of cheap jokes. We'd never been close friends, but we'd worked together for over 20 years. He knew all my strengths and weaknesses, just as I knew his. The difference was that his weaknesses were more obvious. His love of booze, his bi-weekly affairs with secretaries, his tendency to turn a blind eye to minor infractions for the sake of Christmas gift baskets. "Glad to see you're still among the living, Tim." I sat down across from him. "Thanks for agreeing to meet me." "You're welcome." He winked and picked up a cup of coffee. It smelled faintly of cognac. "So, what made Iron Higgs seek out an old buddy?" I didn't like that nickname, but it stuck with me after I refused to change my mind about the city library building's state of disrepair, despite pressure from the mayor and his contractor buddies. The building was closed for 2 years for major repairs. The mayor didn't get re-elected. I got an unspoken promotion. "I need information." I lowered my voice even though the cafe was nearly empty. "About a financial consulting firm called Varley Financial Solutions." Timothy choked on his coffee. "Your brother-in-law? You're gathering information on your own family?" I wrinkled my nose. "Don't jump to conclusions. I just want to know if his business is okay. He never talks to me about work, and lately he seemed tense." That was a half-truth. Nolan did look worried in the recent family photos that Lydia had been posting on her social media accounts. I'd been sneaking around the public library where there was a computer with internet. But my curiosity was driven not by concern but by suspicion. His company was growing too fast, his gifts to his wife too expensive, his business trips too frequent. Timothy leaned back in his chair, studying me. "You know, I could tell you're concerned about your daughter's welfare, but I know you too well, Abraham. You never act without reason. You rarely act out of pure motive." I felt irritation rising in me, but I suppressed it. I needed Timothy. "Think what you want. Do you know anything or don't you?" He was silent, drumming his fingers on the table. "Maybe. My nephew works in the finance department at City Hall. He mentioned that several local businesses had come under SEC scrutiny. Something to do with investment schemes and misuse of funds." My heart skipped a beat. "Was the name of the Varley firm mentioned?" "Not directly," Timothy shook his head. "But there are rumors about a consulting company that attracts investments from retirees, promising high returns. You know, the classic story. You invest 10,000, a year later you get 15. Except that, as my nephew says, the scheme works as long as new investors come. It's a pyramid scheme." I felt my fingers clench into a fist. "Do you have proof?" "Jesus, Abraham," Timothy laughed. "I'm not your detective. I just heard conversations. If you want specifics, you need to talk to Ramon Sanchez." "From the IRS?" "The IRS. He's the head of financial investigations now. And as far as I know, he's got a beef with firms that take senior citizens' money." I pulled out a notebook and wrote down a name. Ramon Sanchez. We met a few times when I was still working. Tough, principled man, like me. "Thank you, Tim." I put the notebook away. "I appreciate your help." "Don't thank me until you know the truth." He leaned closer. "And, Abraham, be careful. If your son-in-law is truly involved in something foul, it could ruin not only his reputation, but also the well-being of your daughter and grandchildren." I knew this. Part of me, a small, almost inaudible part, was saying I should forget all of this, just go to dinner and try to make things right with my family. But a louder voice, the voice that had always guided me, said I should know the truth, even if it would shatter the fragile peace between us. "I'll be careful," I said, even though we both knew it wasn't true. After my meeting with Timothy, I went straight to the municipal building. It had changed since I'd worked there. The new facade, the automatic doors, the young faces at the information desk. But the basic structure remained the same, as did the smell, a mixture of old paper, disinfectant, and despair. "Mr. Higgs," exclaimed the woman behind the counter. I didn't recognize her, but she obviously knew me. "What a surprise! Are you here to see someone in particular?" "Ramon Sanchez," I said, trying to sound casual. "If he's here." "Oh, Mr. Sanchez is always there," she smiled. "Fourth floor, office 412, but you should call ahead. He's a very busy man." "I'll only be a minute." I was already heading for the elevator. Old colleagues, you know. Ramon was indeed there, sitting at a desk littered with files, a telephone receiver clamped between his ear and shoulder. He waved me in when I appeared in the doorway and pointed to a chair across from me. I sat down, looking around the office. No personal photos, no knickknacks, just diplomas on the wall and stacks of papers everywhere. My kind of person. "Yes, until the end of the week," he said into the phone. No extensions. "Thank you." He hung up and looked at me with a tired smile. "Abraham Higgs, I can't remember the last time I saw you. A year? 2? 3, I said. "Wilson's funeral." "Right," he sighed. "A good man lost. So what brings you here? I doubt you were just passing through." I appreciated his candor. "I need information, Ramon, about a financial firm that may be engaging in questionable activities." His eyes have gotten sharper. "You mean as a citizen concerned about possible fraud? Or do you have a personal interest?" I hesitated. Ramon was known for his unyielding honesty. If I said it was about my son-in-law, he might refuse to talk, citing a conflict of interest. "Let's just say I'm worried about the person who might be involved without knowing the full picture." Ramon grinned. Always knew how to beat around the bush when he needed to. "Okay. What's the name of the firm?" "Varley Financial Solutions," I said, watching his reaction carefully. He didn't show surprise, but his fingers tensed slightly on the folder he held. "It was a familiar name. How did you hear about it?" "Rumors," I answered vaguely. "They say they offer too high a return for a risk-averse investment." Sounds suspicious. Ramon looked at me for a long, appraising moment. Then he stood up, walked to the door, and closed it. "We've been watching them for months now," he said quietly, returning to the table. "There's not enough evidence yet for a formal investigation, but there are certain inconsistencies." "What kind of discrepancies?" "The usual red flags. Promises of unrealistic returns. Investment portfolios that never seem to take a loss, even when the entire market is down. Aggressive recruiting of new clients. And most importantly, using new investors' money to pay off old investors." I felt the blood drain from my face. "A pyramid scheme?" "Maybe," he shrugged. "Or just incompetent management covered by creative accounting. Either way, when the hole gets too big, trouble starts. We don't intervene as long as things are running smoothly, but there's a flag hanging on such firms. At the first major glitch..." He runs his finger down his throat. "When do you expect this, disruption?" "It's hard to say. Could be a month, could be a year. Depends on the influx of new investment and market conditions. But it always happens sooner or later." I sat there, digesting the information. Nolan, my son-in-law, was probably a fraud, or at best, an incompetent businessman who hid his mistakes behind a facade of success, either of which confirmed my long-held opinion of him. "Any specific complaints?" I asked. "People who had lost money?" "Not yet," Ramon shook his head. Like I said, everything is going smoothly so far. Payouts are being made on time. Customers are happy. That's part of the problem. No one complains as long as they get what they're promised. But when the system collapses, a lot of people lose their savings, he finished for me. Probably their entire fortune. Mostly older people looking for a steady income in retirement. People like me, I thought. If it weren't for my natural suspicion, I could have been one of the victims. Thank you, Ramon, I stood up. You've been very helpful. Abraham, his voice stopped me at the door. I thought your son-in-law's last name was Varley. Is that just a coincidence? I froze. No, I said finally. Not a coincidence. He nodded as if confirming my suspicions. Be careful. Family matters are always more complicated than they seem. And remember, this information is unofficial. I didn't tell you anything. Of course, I opened the door. I'll see you at the next colleague's funeral. He didn't smile. I spent the rest of the day at the public library, looking up everything I could find about Nolan's company. The official website looked impressive. Professional design, compelling customer testimonials, pictures of a smiling Nolan in an expensive suit shaking hands with important people. But now I was looking at it with different eyes. Which of these were real? Were these clients real people or actors? How many of those smiling retirees would lose everything when the house of cards collapsed? I found several articles in the local press praising Varley's innovative approach to investing. Not one critical word, not one question about how they managed to deliver such high returns. Typical journalism. No one digs deeper than the obvious. Then I came across an investor forum where one user was asking questions about the stability of Varley Financial Solutions. Most of the responses were positive, but one comment caught my eye. Be wary of firms that promise high returns without risk. I checked their investment strategies and they don't match the results they claim. When I tried to withdraw my money, technical problems started. It took me 3 months and the threat of a lawsuit to get my funds back. The comment was deleted a few hours after it was posted, but I managed to take a screenshot, my first real piece of evidence. By evening, I had a small package of information assembled. Screenshots, articles, notes of my conversation with Ramon. Not enough for a full-fledged indictment, but enough to raise serious suspicion. I decided that tomorrow at dinner I would watch Nolan closely, looking for signs of stress or guilt. I might even hint at what I knew, just to see his reaction. But first, I needed to buy gifts for my grandchildren. Despite Lydia's request, I couldn't imagine visiting my grandchildren without presents. It was one of the few joys I had left, seeing their surprised and happy faces as they unwrapped something special. I headed to the mall, a place I usually avoided. Too many people, too much noise, too much useless stuff. But today, I had a mission. I picked out new wireless headphones for Ethan. Expensive, but not so expensive that Lydia could reasonably object. The boy was into music, and his old headphones were shabby as far as I remembered. For Claire, the choice was more difficult. The last time I'd seen her, she was into astronomy. I found a small but powerful telescope at a specialty store, compact, perfect for a budding astronomer. It cost almost $400, which was a significant amount for my budget, but I didn't hesitate. This dinner was probably my last chance to connect with my grandchildren, especially considering what I'd learned about their father's business. On the way home, I stopped in front of a jewelry store. In the display case were gold earrings with small sapphires, just like the ones I'd given Evelyn for our 20th anniversary. She wore them almost every day until she died. Lydia always admired them. Maybe this gift would remind her of better times, that despite all our differences, I was still her father. The saleswoman, a young woman with a luscious smile, showed me the earrings. They were beautiful, but they cost almost $1,000, more than I could afford. Regretfully, I declined and walked out of the store. At home, I carefully wrapped gifts for my grandchildren using holiday paper I found in the closet. leftovers from last Christmas. My fingers, stiff from arthritis, struggled with the ribbons and bows, but the result was acceptable. I'd never been particularly talented at wrapping presents. It had always been Evelyn's prerogative. In the evening, I pulled out my best suit, a dark blue, a little old-fashioned but well-fitting. I hadn't worn it since Evelyn's funeral. I laid it on the bed to steam it in the morning. Then I sat in the chair with the photo album, another thing I rarely reached for. Too many memories, too many missed opportunities. Photos of Lydia as a child, a serious little girl with pigtails, so much like her mother. Pictures of her graduation, of her wedding. Photos of her grandchildren when they were very young. Ethan with his wide, toothless smile. Claire with a pensive look that seemed too wise for a 3-year-old. I closed the album when I felt a traitorous burning in my eyes. Tomorrow I would try to fix what could still be fixed, or at least not make the situation worse. With that thought, I went to bed, but sleep didn't come for a long time. I lay staring at the ceiling, imagining different scenarios for tomorrow night. Some ended in reconciliation, others in more estrangement, but in none of them did I see a future for my son-in-law's company or for the financial security of my daughter and grandchildren. Finally, around 3 a.m., I fell into a restless sleep. I dreamed of Evelyn, young and beautiful, with sapphire earrings in her ears. She looked at me with disappointment and shook her head. "You always think you know best, Abraham," she said, "but sometimes you just ruin what you could have saved." I woke up at dawn with a heavy heart and a clear realization. Tonight's dinner could be a turning point, not just for my relationship with my family, but for their future. And that future was in my hands now, the hands of a stubborn old man who'd spent his entire life believing that the truth was more important than anything else, even if it hurt. Lydia and Nolan's house was in the suburbs of New Bedford, a well-kept 2-story colonial mansion with an immaculately mowed lawn and a driveway paved with expensive stone. I stopped my old Buick next to Nolan's shiny Lexus and Lydia's new Volvo. My car looked out of place in this driveway, as did I myself at this family dinner. I glanced at my watch, 6 p.m. sharp. Punctuality had always been a virtue of mine. Taking the wrapped gifts from the passenger seat, I slowly got out of the car. My knee was bothering me again, but I ignored the pain. A familiar nervousness settled in my stomach. I hated the feeling. It reminded me that despite all my principles and self-righteousness, the fear of rejection lived deep inside. The front door opened before I could even ring the bell. Claire stood on the threshold, her brown hair braided into a neat braid, her eyes, my eyes, looking curious. "Grandfather." She smiled but didn't rush to hug me like she had once done. 11 years old, almost a teenager, too old for such displays of affection. "You're here." Something in her voice, a note of surprise, tingled me. Did they really think I wouldn't come? "I said I would come," I answered, as I entered the house. "And I always keep my word." The house was as spotless inside as it was outside. White walls, modern furniture, artwork that I was sure Nolan had chosen not for its artistic value, but for its price tag. Everything was neat, expensive, and completely impersonal. "Mom's in the kitchen," Claire said, closing the door behind me, "and Dad and Ethan are watching the basketball game. I brought something for you and your brother." I handed her 2 packages. Her eyes widened. "Mom said you're not supposed to bring gifts." "They're little souvenirs," I lied. "Nothing special." She picked up the bags but took her time opening them. "Should I take them upstairs?" "Maybe you should ask your mom," I suggested reluctantly. Claire nodded and disappeared into the kitchen with the bags. I was alone in the hallway, feeling like an intruder. From the living room came the voices of the commentators and the occasional exclamations of Nolan and Ethan. I headed over there. Nolan was sitting in a big leather chair, Ethan on the floor in front of him. They were so engrossed in the game that they only noticed me when I coughed. "Abraham!" Nolan jumped up, his smile not reaching his eyes. Glad you could make it. He always addressed me in you, as if formality could replace genuine respect. Hello, Nolan. I nodded at him, then looked at my grandson. Ethan, you've grown since the last time I saw you. The boy rose to his feet. At 13, he was almost my height, though much thinner. He had Nolan's face, soft features, blonde hair, but Lydia's eyes were brown, attentive. Hi, Grandpa. He hugged me awkwardly, quickly, and without enthusiasm. Good game? I asked, nodding at the screen. Great! Ethan exclaimed, revitalizing. The Celtics are leading by 10 points and Mitchell just... Ethan, help your mom set the table, Nolan interrupted him, glancing at his watch. I think dinner's almost ready. The boy nodded obediently and left the room. Nolan and I were alone. He turned off the TV and turned to me with the same strained smile. Whiskey? He offered, pointing to the bar in the corner of the room. No, thanks. I never drank in his presence, fearing that alcohol would loosen my tongue more than it should. How's business, Nolan? His smile faltered slightly. It's fine. We're expanding. Opened an office in Providence last month. Impressive. I sat down in the chair across from him. For a small consulting firm, that's rapid growth. You can't stand still in the financial world, he poured himself a whiskey. You either grow or you die. What about investment strategies? I tried to keep my voice casual. Still offering those high returns you mentioned at Christmas? He took a sip, his apple of his eye twitching visibly. We diversify our clients' portfolios according to their needs and risk level, he replied in a learned phrase. The results speak for themselves. I'm sure they do. I let the pause linger. It's amazing how you're able to deliver such consistent returns in volatile times. Nolan looked at me intently. Something akin to suspicion flickered in his gaze. We have a good team of analysts, he said finally, and time-tested methods. Fortunately, or unfortunately, our conversation was interrupted by Lydia's appearance. She entered the room, wiping her hands on her apron. Her brown hair was gathered in a careless bun, and her face showed signs of fatigue, which she tried to hide behind a smile. Daddy, she came over and gave me a quick kiss on the cheek. I'm glad you came. Her perfume was the same one I gave Evelyn every year for her birthday, a light floral scent with a hint of vanilla. It was the only thing my daughter took from her mother, except for her looks. I brought the children small gifts, I said without apology. I hope you don't mind. She sighed but didn't argue. Dinner's ready. We can talk about it later. We walked into the dining room where Ethan and Claire were already setting out the dishes. The table was set impeccably white tablecloths, crystal glasses, silver candelabras. Evelyn would have appreciated the elegance. Baked salmon with vegetables and rice, Lydia announced when we were all seated, and homemade apple pie for dessert. Sounds wonderful, I said sincerely. Lydia had always been a good cook, another trait inherited from her mother. Nolan opened a bottle of white wine and filled glasses for everyone but the kids and me. I preferred water. A toast, he raised his glass. To family. We raised our glasses. When I looked across the table at Lydia, there was hope in her eyes, hope for a peaceful evening, for a truce. I nodded to her, promising to make a silent effort. The first 20 minutes of dinner went surprisingly smoothly. The salmon was cooked perfectly and the conversation revolved around safe topics, the weather, recent movies, a new book Claire was reading. Ethan talked about his high school biology project, and I was impressed with his knowledge of ecosystems. That sounds fascinating, I said. When I was your age, I built model bridges. Engineering has always interested me. Really? Ethan looked surprised. I thought you were always an inspector. At first I wanted to be an engineer, I smiled at the memory. But life turned out differently. In those days, college was too expensive for a laborer's family. That didn't stop you from becoming an expert in construction, Lydia remarked with unexpected warmth. I made up for my lack of formal education with experience and common sense. I sipped my water. But I've always regretted not going to college. That's why I was so insistent that you get a college education. And we're grateful for that, Nolan interjected. Lydia's degree in economics came in handy in our business. Does Mom work with you, Dad? Claire asked, and I realized that she didn't know about Lydia's involvement in the business. Nolan and Lydia exchanged quick glances. Sometimes I help with the bookkeeping, Lydia said evasively. Nothing serious. Interesting, I thought. Another red flag. If things are going so well, why is Lydia hiding her involvement in the business from the children? How's your play, Claire? Lydia changed the subject. Are you ready for the premiere? Claire became animated as she talked about her role in the school production of Peter Pan. She was playing Wendy, and, judging by her enthusiasm, she was taking the role seriously. I rehearse every day, she said proudly. Miss Bennett says I have talent. Your grandmother loved the theater too, I smiled, remembering. She played in an amateur troupe when we first met. She was a marvelous Ophelia. Wasn't she? Claire looked surprised. Mom never told me. Much of the past gets lost between generations, I said, looking at Lydia. Sometimes on purpose. Lydia looked guilty. I just never thought it was important. Family history is always important, I turned to Ethan. You know, your great-grandfather was a fishing boat captain, a brave man. He once saved the whole crew when their boat got caught in a storm off the coast of Maine. That's cool. Ethan looked impressed. Do we have pictures? In my house, I nodded. Come over sometime and I'll show you the old albums. It's not just the history of our family, but of New Bedford. The kids are very busy with their studies and extracurriculars, Nolan interjected quickly. Maybe on summer vacation. I felt a pang of disappointment, but I didn't show it. Of course, studying is more important, I agreed, and then I couldn't help but add, although I've noticed that Ethan always has time for video games. The atmosphere at the table changed instantly. Lydia tensed. Nolan straightened in his chair. Ethan only gets to play after he's done his homework, Lydia said with pressure. We have a system. A system, I repeated. How many hours a day does he spend in front of the screen? Dad, Lydia said warningly, I'm just curious. I held up my hands in a conciliatory gesture. When I was young, we spent more time outdoors, building forts, exploring the forest, developed practical skills. Times have changed, Nolan said firmly. Digital skills are just as important now. Ethan is taking a programming class. Programming is a useful skill, I admitted, but there's no substitute for working with your hands, building, repairing, creating something tangible. Grandpa is right, Claire suddenly supported me. At school, they tell us that we should limit the time in front of the screen. It's bad for the brain. Thank you, Claire, I smiled at her. Wise girl. Okay, we all get Grandpa's point. Lydia stood up, starting to collect the empty plates. Who's ready for dessert? But I'm not done yet. Speaking of practical skills, I turned to Nolan. I noticed the railing on your back porch is loose. I've been meaning to tell you for a while. It could be dangerous, especially for children. Nolan looked annoyed. I'll call a handyman next week. There's no need to spend money, I shrugged. I could fix them in an hour. I have tools in my car. We prefer professionals, Nolan replied coldly. I was a building inspector for 32 years, I reminded him. I think I'm qualified to fix the railing. Dad, please, Lydia sighed. Not now. I fell silent, feeling that familiar irritation building up inside me. They treated me like a helpless old man, incapable of even simple repairs, as if my experience was worthless. Lydia served apple pie with vanilla ice cream. It was delicious, but I could barely taste it. My attention was focused on Nolan, who looked increasingly tense as the evening wore on. He checked his phone frequently, twice going out to answer calls, signs of a man under pressure. So, Nolan, I said when he returned after the second call, I hear the investment market is going through some tough times. How is that affecting your business?" He smiled strainedly. "We are well diversified. Small fluctuations in the market don't bother us." "Slight fluctuations?" I raised an eyebrow. "The last quarter showed the biggest drop since 2008. Many firms went bankrupt." "Why the sudden interest in the financial markets, Abraham?" Nolan tried to keep his tone casual, but I could see the tension in the corners of his eyes. "I don't remember you being interested in investments before. At my age, you start thinking about the future." I sipped my water. "Inheritance, retirement savings, about what will be left to your children and grandchildren." Lydia frowned. "Dad, let's not talk about such things at dinner." "Why not?" I shrugged. "These are important questions. For example, I've long wanted to ask, how does your firm provide such a high rate of return for clients? 15% per annum, if I remember correctly from your advertising. Impressive, considering that the average return on the market over the last 10 years is about 7%. Nolan turned pale. "Our investment strategies are complicated. I don't think this is the right time to discuss them." "I think it's the right time." I stepped forward. "Especially since a lot of these firms are under regulatory scrutiny. I hear the SEC has stepped up their inspections." There was silence. The children looked from me to their parents, sensing the tension but not understanding why. "Children, please take your plates to the kitchen," Lydia said quietly. "And you can go upstairs, watch a movie or play." "But we haven't opened Grandpa's presents yet," Claire protested. "Later," Lydia said. "Now please go upstairs." The children obeyed reluctantly, giving us puzzled looks. When it was just the three of us, Lydia turned to me, her eyes narrowed. "What are you doing, Dad?" "Just inquiring about the welfare of my only daughter's family," I tried to say calmly. "Is that a crime?" "You're snooping," she shook her head. "You always do, looking for problems where there aren't any." "Are you sure there isn't?" I shifted my gaze to Nolan. "Because judging by your reaction, I've hit the mark." Nolan stood up, his face reddening. "I don't have to report my business to you, Abraham. You were invited to a family dinner, not a corporate audit." "You're right," I nodded. "But when I see that my daughter and grandchildren could be in danger because of questionable business practices, I can't keep quiet." "Daddy!" Lydia exclaimed. "What are you talking about?" I sighed, realizing that the point of no return had passed. "I've been doing a little research, Lydia. Your husband's company is under scrutiny by financial regulators. There are suspicions of a pyramid scheme." "What?" She looked at Nolan. "Is that true?" Nolan looked like he'd been punched. That's slander." He pointed his finger in my direction. "He's always hated me, always thought I wasn't good enough for his precious daughter." "Nolan," Lydia said softly, "answer the question. Is it true?" "Of course not." He ran his hand through his hair. "We've had some unorthodox investment decisions, perhaps some accounting optimizations. But this is normal practice. Everybody does it." "Everybody does it is no excuse under the law," I pointed out. "Nor is it a defense for your clients who have entrusted you with their savings." "You!" Nolan turned to me, his eyes burning with rage. "You're doing this on purpose. You've always tried to destroy our family with your suspicions and criticism." "I'm trying to protect my family," I replied, remaining calm. "What will happen to Lydia and the kids when your scheme falls apart? When the federal agents show up with an arrest warrant? Have you thought about that?" "Daddy, that's enough." Lydia stood up, her hands shaking. "You're out of line. You have no right to barge into our lives with your accusations." "I have a right to be concerned about the welfare of my family." I stood up too, leaning on the table. "And if your husband is leading you to financial ruin and possible jail time, I will speak up." "You know nothing about our lives," Lydia screamed. "You show up every few months, criticize everything you see, and think you have the right to tell us how to live our lives." I know more than you think. My voice became harsher. I know that your husband is raising money from new investors to pay interest to the old ones. I know he's been lying about his investment strategies. And I know that when this scheme collapses, and it will, you will lose everything: your home, your reputation, your children's future. Nolan looked like he was about to throw up. Lydia shifted her gaze from him to me, her face contorted with a mixture of anger, fear, and disbelief. "Go away," she said quietly at last. "Lydia, go away." Her voice broke into a scream. "You are no longer part of our family. Go away." I looked at my daughter, trying to find some understanding in her eyes, but all I saw was rage and pain. She had made her choice, and so have I. "Remember this day, Lydia," I said, feeling something inside me snap. "This is when you buried not only your father, but also your future." I turned slowly and walked toward the exit. No one followed me to stop me. I heard Lydia burst into tears as Nolan said something quietly to her. But I didn't look back. In the hallway, I stopped for a moment. There was music coming from upstairs, probably Ethan listening to something on those headphones I'd never gotten him. My gifts had been left somewhere in the kitchen, forgotten in the midst of the conflict, as was my hope for reconciliation. I went outside. The night was cold, the stars hidden by clouds. Getting in my car, I pulled out my phone and opened my contacts. I found Ramon Sanchez's number. My finger hovered over the call button. I thought about Lydia, about her words. "You're not part of our family anymore." Maybe she was right. Maybe I was never truly part of their family. Too rigid, too principled, too passionate about finding the truth to see it hurt those I loved. But it was too late for doubt. I'd made my choice the moment I'd decided to reveal what I'd learned about Nolan's business, and now I had to follow through. I pressed the call button. 3 beeps, and Ramon answered. Sanchez speaking. "Ramon, this is Abraham Higgs." My voice sounded tired but determined. "Remember we talked about the firm Varley Financial Solutions? I have some information that might interest you." I started the car and pulled into the driveway without looking back at the house where my grandchildren, my daughter, and the last remnants of what had once been my family remained. In the days that followed, I behaved like a man condemned to carry out a sentence that I myself had passed. Consistently, methodically, without emotion, I gave Ramon Sanchez all the material I had gathered on Nolan's company. Printouts of screenshots from financial forums where former clients of Varley Financial Solutions complained about delayed payments, copies of promotional brochures promising unrealistic returns, the names of several elderly investors I tracked down through acquaintances at the local retirement club. "Do you realize that this could have serious consequences for your family?" Ramon asked me when we met in his office the Monday after that ill-fated dinner. "I do," I replied, looking out the window at the municipal parking lot where officials were scurrying around like ants. "But the consequences will be worse if this pyramid continues to grow and then collapses." "A lot of people would rather warn a relative unofficially," Ramon said, poring over the documents I'd provided. "Give him a chance to make things right." "He wouldn't have listened," I shook my head. "Besides, how many people would have lost their savings while he was making things right?" Ramon stared at me for a long moment as if trying to figure out whether I was driven by righteous anger or cold revenge. "I'll launch a formal investigation," he said finally. "But it will take time. Weeks, maybe months." "I have time," I replied. "And his clients?" He didn't answer, just nodded and continued taking notes. As I walked out of the municipal building, I felt a strange lightness, as if I had shed a heavy weight I had been carrying all my life. The decision had been made, the action had been taken. Now all that was left was to wait. On Wednesday, I called Miles Hawthorne, a lawyer I had known for almost 40 years. We weren't close friends, but he handled all my legal affairs, including the probate of Evelyn's death. "Abraham, it's good to hear from you," he said when I explained the purpose of the call. Sure, we can meet to discuss changes to your will. How about Friday at 2 o'clock in the afternoon? That would be fine, I agreed. May I ask what prompted the need for the revision? A change in family circumstances, I answered vaguely. He didn't insist. Miles had always been a tactful man, and for that I appreciated him. I spent the next 2 days at home, not answering the phone. The phone rang 3 times on Monday night, and each time the caller ID showed Lydia. I didn't pick up. What could I say to her? That I was sorry? That would be a lie. I didn't regret exposing Nolan's fraud. I might have regretted the form, the timing, the failure to find a way to protect my daughter without destroying her marriage. But not about the action itself. While perusing the local newspaper on Thursday, I came across a small item in the financial news section, local investment firm under scrutiny by regulators. Nolan's company wasn't mentioned by name, but for those who knew what it was about, the hint was clear. Ramon worked quickly. I clipped the note and put it in my desk drawer, the first tangible evidence that the wheel of justice had begun to turn. On Friday, at precisely 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I walked into Miles's office. His secretary, a woman in her 60s whom I remembered as a young girl, smiled at me. "Mr. Higgs, Mr. Hawthorne is expecting you. Come in." Miles stood up from the desk as I entered. He looked older than I remembered, deep wrinkles around his eyes, almost completely white hair, but the handshake remained firm. "Abraham, good to see you." He pointed to the chair across from his desk. "Sit down, please." I sat down, looking around the office. Nothing had changed over the years. The same diplomas on the walls, the same solid oak desk, the same legal volumes on the shelves. There was something soothing about that constancy. "So," Miles folded his hands on the table, "you want to change your will. May I ask what kind of changes you're planning?" "I want to exclude my daughter Lydia from being an heir," I said bluntly. Miles raised his eyebrows but kept his professional calm. "It's a big decision, Abraham. Are you sure?" "Absolutely." "May I ask why?" "It will help protect the will from possible future challenges." I took a deep breath. We had a conflict, a big one. She said I was no longer part of their family. Miles nodded, taking notes. "I see. Who do you want to appoint as heir in her place?" "My grandchildren, Ethan and Claire Varley." I hesitated for a second. "But on the condition that they'll have access to the inheritance only when they reach the age of 25. Until then, everything would be managed by a trust fund." "A reasonable solution." Miles made some more notes. "And who do you want to appoint as trustee?" I wondered. It was an important question that I hadn't fully thought through. Not Lydia, obviously, and not Nolan, who might be in jail by then. Someone neutral, trustworthy. "You," I decided, "if you're willing." Miles looked surprised. "I'm flattered, Abraham, but I'm not much younger than you. By the time your grandchildren reach the age of 25, I could be—" "Appoint a successor from your own firm," I interrupted him. "Someone you trust, and take a good percentage of the management fee. I want my grandchildren to get their inheritance intact when the time comes." He rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Well, I can arrange that. What goes into the inheritance besides the house and savings?" "Some stocks I bought years ago. A few antiques, including my father's gold pocket watch, that should go to Ethan, and a collection of books on maritime history. I'd like to donate them to a local museum." "And personal effects? Photographs, letters, documents?" "I've been thinking." "Let the grandchildren decide what to do with them when the time comes. If they don't want to keep them, let them give them to the New Bedford Historical Archives." Miles nodded, continuing to make notes. "There's one more thing," I added. "I want to leave a letter for my grandchildren to receive with the inheritance, to explain to them my actions, my decisions, to make them understand." "That makes sense," Miles agreed. "I'll attach it to the will as a confidential document. Thank you." We spent another hour discussing the details. Miles was meticulous, asking a lot of questions, suggesting alternatives. I appreciated his thoroughness, though sometimes it bordered on the obsessive. "Abraham," he said when we had finished discussing the legal aspects, "I speak now not as your lawyer, but as someone who has known you for many years. Are you sure you want to exclude Lydia completely? Family conflicts tend to resolve themselves over time." "Not this one," I shook my head. "The bridges have been burned, Miles, on both sides." He stared at me for a long moment as if trying to discern doubt or regret behind my resolute facade. But there weren't any, or I was hiding them too well, even from myself. "Okay," he said finally. "I'll have the paperwork ready by next week. You'll have to come over to sign them in front of witnesses." "Thank you, Miles." I stood up, extending my hand. "For everything." "Take care of yourself, Abraham." He shook my hand. Maybe give yourself a little time before you make a final decision." "Time won't change the facts," I answered and walked out of his office. It was drizzling outside. I pulled up the collar of my coat and walked slowly home, deciding not to call a cab despite a knee that ached more than usual. The physical pain was a distraction from the mental pain. Walking past the office building that housed Nolan's company, I slowed my step. The Varley Financial Solutions sign still hung on the facade, but the parking lot in front of the building was nearly empty. Only two cars, Lydia's silver Volvo and Nolan's black Lexus. They were there, the two of them, probably planning their next moves, trying to save the sinking ship. I felt a prick of conscience. Maybe I should have warned Lydia beforehand. Give her a chance to distance herself from her husband's business, to protect herself and the children. But I knew my daughter she would have sided with Nolan, tried to protect him, maybe even become complicit in his efforts to cover his tracks. No, I did the right thing. Cruel, but right. Sometimes the medicine had to be bitter to be effective. I continued on my way without looking back. At home, I took off my soaked clothes, took a hot shower, and sat in a chair with a cup of strong tea. The house was quiet, with only the old clock on the wall counting down the seconds and the rain drumming on the roof. I pulled out the photo album, the same one I'd looked through before dinner at Lydia's. I opened it to the page with the wedding photos. Evelyn was beautiful in her simple white dress. Not lavish, not flashy. She'd always favored elegant simplicity. I stood next to her, young, with dark hair and a serious look. Even then, you could see the hardness in my eyes that had only grown stronger with time. I turned the page, the first pictures with the newborn Lydia. Evelyn held her in her arms, glowing with happiness. I stood beside her, proud but even then a little aloof. Not that I didn't love my daughter. I did, very much. But I had always been a person who was better at expressing my love through actions than through words or displays of affection. Another page. Lydia in her school uniform, her first day of first grade. She smiled at the camera, showing off her missing front tooth. Evelyn is next to her. I was the photographer, so I was absent from the picture. Symbolic. I have always been behind the scenes in my daughter's life, providing, protecting, guiding, but rarely was I truly present emotionally. Evelyn told me this all the time, especially when Lydia became a teenager and the first serious conflicts began. "You can't just tell her what to do, Abraham," Evelyn used to say. "You have to listen. You have to understand her feelings." But I didn't know how, or didn't want to learn. I believed I knew better, that my life experience, my wisdom was more important than the emotional needs of a teenager. I wanted Lydia to be strong, independent, principled, like me. I didn't realize I was making her unhappy. When she announced her engagement to Nolan, I immediately disliked him, not just because of his questionable business plans, but because I felt he was too soft, too accommodating for my daughter. She needed someone with character, with principles, with willpower. At least, that's what I thought. Now, looking at their wedding photos, I saw something I hadn't noticed then. Lydia glowed next to Nolan. He looked at her with adoration. They were happy until I began to interfere, to criticize, to suspect. Maybe Evelyn was right. Maybe I'd always been too rigid, too principled, too sure I was right. Maybe it was this character trait that had destroyed my relationship with my daughter long before that ill-fated dinner. But even now, realizing my mistakes, I couldn't change my mind. Nolan was a con man who defrauded gullible people. He deserved to be exposed, regardless of how it would affect my relationship with my family. Truth and justice have always been more important to me than personal relationships. Perhaps that was my greatest strength and my greatest weakness at the same time. I closed the sketchbook and set aside my cup of unfinished tea. Tomorrow, I will begin writing a letter for my grandchildren, a letter they will read many years later when I am no longer alive. I will explain to them my actions, my motives. I will tell them about my mistakes and what they can learn from my example. Maybe they'll understand. Maybe they'll forgive. Maybe they won't. But at least they'll know the truth. Monday morning, while browsing the news on my old laptop at the public library, I came across a headline that made my heart beat faster. New Bedford financial advisory firm under investigation. Possible Ponzi scheme. This time, the name Varley Financial Solutions was mentioned explicitly. The article said the company's office was visited by SEC officials who seized documents and computers. No arrests had yet been made, but the investigation was ongoing. Clients of the firm were advised to contact a special hotline. I felt a strange numbness, not triumph, not satisfaction, just a quiet acceptance of the inevitable. The wheel began to turn faster than I expected. Ramon was indeed working efficiently. When I returned home, I found 3 missed calls from Lydia and 1 voicemail. Her voice sounded strained, on the verge of tears. "Dad, it's Lydia. I know you don't want to talk to me, but Nolan's in trouble. Serious trouble. His company's being audited. His accounts are frozen. You were right about his business. He says he didn't know anything, that his CFO orchestrated the whole thing without his knowledge, but I don't know what to believe. The kids are scared. Please call me back." I erased the message. Nolan was putting the blame on his subordinates, a typical tactic. Of course he knew everything. He'd been at the center of this scheme from the beginning. The phone rang again. Lydia's number. I watched it vibrate on the desk, fighting the urge to answer it. What could I say to her? "I'm sorry." A lie. "I warned you, didn't I?" Cruel and unhelpful. "I'll help you." How? I had set this mechanism in motion myself, and now I couldn't stop it even if I wanted to. I didn't answer. Instead, I sat down at my desk and began writing a letter for my grandchildren. A letter that would explain to them why their grandfather did what he did, why he ruined their father's business, probably sent him to prison, ruined their family. "Dear Ethan and Claire," I wrote, "by the time you read this letter, I will no longer be alive. But I want you to know the truth about the events that changed our family many years ago." I wrote for hours, laying out the whole story from my first suspicions to the final conversation with Ramon. I wasn't trying to make excuses or sugarcoat my actions. I was simply telling the truth as I saw it. "I know that many people, including your mother, think I'm a cruel, ruthless man," I continued. "Maybe they're right. But I've always believed that truth and justice are more important than personal comfort or family ties. I couldn't stand by and watch your father deceive gullible people, even if exposure meant the loss of my family." I paused, rereading what I had written. Wasn't that a little harsh for young men who had probably forgiven and forgotten long ago? But no, they deserved to know the whole truth, without mitigation or excuses. "I've made a lot of mistakes in my life," I continued. "I was too harsh with your mother, too critical, too sure I was right. I didn't know how to listen or admit my mistakes. Those traits of my character destroyed my relationship with your mother long before I exposed your father's business. And for that, I am truly sorry." I pondered, trying to find the right words to end the letter. How could I explain to them that despite everything that had happened, I loved them? That my every action, no matter how cruel it seemed, was motivated by concern for them, for their future. I leave you with everything I have, I wrote, not out of guilt or as an attempt to buy forgiveness, but because you are an extension of my family, bearers of my blood and my values. I hope you grow up to be strong, honest, principled people, but I also hope you will learn what I have never been able to learn, the balance between principle and mercy, between truth and love. I dated it and signed it, then folded the letter and tucked it away in an envelope which I inscribed, "For Ethan and Claire Varley, to be opened after my death." This envelope I would put in the safe with the will. Now I had to prepare for the next step, meeting with Miles to sign the new documents, and for a possible confrontation with Lydia, who I was sure would show up on my doorstep sooner or later. I was prepared for both events. The lot had been cast, and now all I had to do was wait and watch the consequences of my actions unfold. Exactly 7 days had passed since that ill-fated dinner. I was sitting in my chair, rereading a letter from my grandchildren when the phone rang. Lydia's number. She had called 12 times in the past week, I counted, and 12 times I hadn't picked up the phone. But today, something was different. I knew I had to answer, that this was the moment of truth. The clock on the wall showed exactly 6 p.m., exactly the same time I'd crossed the threshold of their house a week ago. "Abraham Higgs," I answered, formal as ever. "Daddy." Lydia's voice sounded broken, tears and panic. "Thank God you answered. Daddy, I need help. We need help." I remained silent, giving her a chance to continue. "It's all falling apart," she said quickly, words layered on top of each other. "The SEC came to Nolan's office. They seized computers, documents. All company accounts are frozen. Our personal accounts are frozen. We can't withdraw a dime." I listened to her panicked speech, feeling strangely detached, as if it were happening to someone else, in some movie. "Nolan is under investigation," she continued. "He's going to jail, Daddy, and we could lose the house. We can't pay the mortgage. The kids. They don't understand. They're scared." "Where's Nolan now?" I asked, finally interrupting her flow of words. "With a lawyer," her voice trembled. "He says he can explain everything, that it was a mistake, a misunderstanding. But I've seen the papers, Daddy. There's no mistake. It's exactly what you said it was." I closed my eyes. At last, she recognized the truth. "We need to meet," I said. "Can you do it tonight?" "Yes," she sounded hopeful. "Yes, of course. I can come over right now." "In an hour," I said. "I have some things to prepare." I hung up the phone and slowly rose from the chair. I had a plan in my head, formed over the 7 days. I opened the safe hidden behind a painting of a seascape. Evelyn loved the sea, though she was afraid to swim. I took out a folder with the documents I'd prepared with Miles. A new will, a letter for the grandchildren, copies of all the materials I'd given to Ramon and the financial regulators. Then I made tea, not for me, for Lydia. She always liked tea with honey and lemon when she was upset. Evelyn made it for her after every childhood tragedy, from a broken doll to her first broken heart. Exactly 1 hour later, the doorbell rang. I opened it. Lydia stood on the threshold, her face pale, dark circles under her eyes. She looked like she hadn't slept in several nights. "Daddy?" She made a movement like she wanted to hug me, but she stopped. There was still a wall of unspoken accusations and resentment between us. "Come in," I stepped aside, letting her pass. She walked into the living room and stopped in the middle of the room, looking around uncertainly, as if she were here for the first time, even though she'd grown up in this house. "Sit down," I pointed to a chair. "I've made tea." "Thank you." She sat down, mechanically taking the cup from my hands. I sat opposite, studying her face. Despite her fatigue and anxiety, she still looked like Evelyn, the same eyes, the same curve of her lips. Only the temper was mine. Stubborn, proud, unable to admit mistakes. Until today. "Tell me everything," I said. "From the beginning." She took a sip of tea, gathering her thoughts. "The day before yesterday, the SEC came to the office. They had a warrant to search and seize documents. They said they had received anonymous information about possible irregularities in the company's operations." She looked up. "But it wasn't anonymous, was it? It was you." I didn't deny it. "Go on." "They took computers, file folders, customer databases." Nolan was in shock. He yelled that it was a mistake, that it was legitimate. "But then they came with an arrest warrant." Her voice shook. "The only reason he wasn't arrested was because our lawyer arranged for a voluntary appearance. But it's a matter of days, maybe hours. Dad, they know everything. How he used new investors' money to pay off old investors. How he falsified earnings reports." "What about you?" I interrupted her. "Did you know about it?" She lowered her eyes. "Not all of it. Not fully. I suspected something was wrong. The numbers didn't always add up, but Nolan always had an explanation, and I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe it was legit, because you liked the life his money could provide." It wasn't a question. She flinched at the directness of my words, but didn't deny it. "Yes," she whispered. "The house, the cars, the kids' school, it all costs money." "Money that Nolan stole from other people," I said harshly. "Daddy, please," she raised her pleading eyes to me. "I know you were right about Nolan. I know what he did was wrong. But this isn't about him right now. This is about me and the kids. We could lose everything." "And you want me to help," I finished for her. "Yes," she nodded. "You have savings. Not much, I know, but enough to help us get back on our feet. At least for the first while, until I get a job." I looked at her for a long, long time. She held my gaze. There was pleading in her eyes, but also something else. The realization that she was asking for the impossible. She knew me too well. "I can't help you, Lydia," I said at last. "Can't or won't." There was bitterness in her voice. "Both." I stood up and walked over to the desk where the file folder lay. "But before we go any further, I want to show you something." I pulled out copies of the materials I'd collected on Nolan's company, screenshots from financial forums, articles, notes on conversations with Ramon and Timothy, an analysis of Varley Financial Solutions promotional materials with their unrealistic promises. "What is this?" she asked, though I think she had already guessed. "Evidence," I replied. "Evidence that your husband's company was a pyramid scheme. Evidence that I'd been collecting for months and had given to Ramon Sanchez of the municipality's finance department. It was this information that triggered the investigation." Lydia looked at the documents, her face growing paler and paler. You planned this," she whispered. "All this time you've been gathering information against Nolan, against us." "Not against you," I corrected. "Against a fraud that would ruin the lives of so many people, including you and the kids. I tried to warn you at that dinner, but you wouldn't listen." "You could have just told me," she raised her voice. "In private, not make a scene in front of the kids." "You wouldn't have believed me." I shook my head. "You would have told Nolan, and he would have destroyed the evidence. He would have continued his scheme until it collapsed on its own with even more disastrous consequences." She was silent, realizing I was right. "And now you've come to me for help," I continued. "But you have to understand that I can't support something that's built on lies and deceit, even if it's the life of my daughter and my grandchildren." "What are you saying?" Her voice shook. I pulled another document out of the folder, a copy of my new will. "I have changed my will," I said, holding the paper out to her. "I've excluded you from inheritance. All of my assets, all of my savings will go directly to Ethan and Claire when they reach the age of 25. Until then, Everything will be managed by a trust, with no early withdrawals. She stared at the document as if she couldn't believe her eyes. You're disinheriting me? Now? When we're in this situation? I'm protecting your children's future, I said firmly, to make sure they get at least something when this is over. You don't trust me, that wasn't a question. I don't trust your judgment, I clarified. You chose Nolan, turned a blind eye to his machinations, let him risk the well-being of your children. And now that it's all falling apart, you come to me for help, as if I'm supposed to undo the consequences of your mistakes. You are my father, her voice broke. Isn't that the point? Helping your children when they're wrong? There's a difference between helping and indulging, I replied. If I gave you the money now, what would change? Would you go on living with Nolan? Will you continue to turn a blind eye to his actions? Or would you find another man who would make your life comfortable, no matter what the cost? She jumped up, her face contorted with anger and pain. You are unfair. You've always been like this, hard, uncompromising above everyone else. You ruined my family and now you refuse to help me. I didn't destroy your family, Lydia, I said calmly. Nolan did it by his actions. I merely set the machinery of justice in motion. And you're proud of that? She looked at me with disgust. No, I shook my head. I'm not proud, but I'm not sorry. She stood there, fists clenched, tears streaming down her face. What am I going to do? She whispered. Where do I go? How do I take care of my children? Start over, I said. Get a job. Get an apartment you can afford. Live within your means. Teach your children to value honesty and hard work over pretty facades and easy money. You're a heartless old man, she said. Mom would never. Don't you dare speak for Evelyn, I interrupted her. She never approved of lying and deceit, even for comfort. Lydia shook her head, wiping away her tears. You told me that night to remember this day, she said quietly. You said I had buried not only my father, but also my future. You planned this, didn't you? All of it. My request for help. Your refusal. You knew this would happen. I didn't answer. What could I say? That a part of me, a dark, vengeful part of me, had really seen this moment coming and was waiting for it? That I wanted her to come to me, broken, begging for help so that I could refuse her as she had refused me in her life? Goodbye, Daddy, she said, heading for the door. I hope you are happy in your righteousness and solitude. She left, slamming the door. I stood in the middle of the room, listening to her car start, to the rustle of the tires on the gravel, to the hushed sound of the engine in the distance. And then there was silence. The absolute deafening silence that had always been in this house, but that I'd never noticed before, filling it with memories of Evelyn, thoughts of Lydia and the grandchildren, plans for revenge against Nolan. Now all those distractions were gone. Revenge had been served. The truth had triumphed. I was right, as always, and I was alone, as I'd never been before. I slowly returned to my chair, my gaze falling on the picture of Evelyn on the mantelpiece. She was smiling that special smile that always appeared on her face when she knew I was making a mistake, but she let me, knowing that I had to learn from the experience. I was right, I said to the portrait. I did what I had to do. The portrait was silent, but I could almost hear her reply, Being right isn't everything, Abraham. Sometimes it's more important to be kind. I closed my eyes. The bitter satisfaction of restoring justice was mixed with the acute realization of loss. I had won the battle, but I had lost my family. Forever. The embers crackled in the fireplace. Outside the window, night was falling, and I sat in an empty house filled with the ghosts of the past and the echo of words I could never take back. Remember this day. It is now that you have buried not only your father, but your future. I was right. How bitter it is to be right.